You're listening to Winnipeg's Classic 107. My name is Simon Rusnak. What do the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra, Albert Einstein, and the National Public Radio Broadcaster of India all have in common? A fellow by the name of Walter Kaufmann. To connect those seemingly disparate dots, we've reached Simon Wynberg, Artistic Director of the Toronto-based ARC Ensemble. Hello.
Greetings.
Well, what a
Nice
pleasure.
to be here.
And how nice to have you here on Winnipeg's Classic 107. Well, before we get to Walter Kaufmann, I'd first like to ask you to introduce us to the ARC Ensemble, which you founded back in 2002. Can you tell us a little bit about the group?
I was originally asked to put an in-house ensemble together for the Royal Conservatory of Music. And it was to show off the fine faculty members and to do concerts and recordings and to act as a kind of emissary for the Royal Conservatory. And right from the get-go, I asked Peter Simon, who had invited me to initiate this, whether it wasn't a good idea to avoid the standard repertoire and go for something that would actually present stories and interesting additions to the repertoire and get us, in fact, more attention. And of course, we obviously do program, Mozart clarinet quintet and famous piano quintets by Elgar and Dvorak and whoever might come along. But our main focus has been on repertoire that's outside the canon.
Exploring the music of lesser known, near forgotten composers, and the Grammy and Juno nominated discographies most certainly showcase that. Names like Walter Braunfels and Vyacheslav Wynberg and Julius Röntgen and Szymon Laks, hardly household names. As you mentioned, these are composers born in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. I'm curious, what specifically about this period draws you to it musically?
Well, I think that the most vital part about this music is that these were composers who were sidelined not because they were bad composers or because their music wasn't any good, but they were sidelined simply because of either race or the political circumstances they found themselves in, or because when they went into exile they couldn't find the right job or the right connections, or they didn't have enough English. I mean, it was simple as that. And so, I feel that it's a real obligation, really, to look at these composers because they've been silenced not because of something even as frivolous as fashion, but because of a real attempt to silence them initially forever. And if they hadn't escaped, they would have been.
I mean, indeed, just the persecution that they faced, and the other thing too is there's just so much music to explore, isn't there? Music that's been, as I say, near forgotten, and Walter Kaufmann is just one of those composers. That brings us to this latest disc, Chamber Works by Walter Kaufmann. I mean, being a Winnipegger, my first and really only encounter with the name Walter Kaufmann was in reading program notes for the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra. I mean, he, the first music director of the WSO, appointed in 1948. But I had no idea of the fascinating life which brought him to Winnipeg, the music he composed, and all of the connections he made along the way. How did you come to learn of Walter Kaufmann and his music?
Well, I can't really take any solo credit for it. I got an email from my colleague, Brett Werb, who's actually originally, his family is originally from Winnipeg. So it's
always a connection.
It seems that everybody's from Winnipeg at one time or another. So anyway, Brett said, do you know this guy, Walter Kaufmann? And he said, he sounds like an interesting guy. And do you know any of his music? I said, never heard of him. And he suggested that we go down to Indiana, where Walter ended up at Indiana University, the music department, the Jacobs School of Music. And we spent a couple of days going through the Walter Kaufmann archives, which are considerable. They have basically all his music, correspondence, photographs, you name it, it's there. It's an entire life in I don't know how many boxes. So we went through that, and I obviously immediately went for the chamber music because that's what I do, and I started looking through the works, and I thought, this is really really interesting stuff, um, and so that's really where it started. I can credit Brett for putting me on the trail and for encouraging uh, our pursuit of Mr. Kaufmann.
So let's go back to the very beginning then. Born in 1907, can we talk a little bit about his early years and the musical foundation that was laid in his university studies in Prague and then in Berlin?
Yeah, well, his first studies were with his uncle Moritz, who was his father Julius's brother. And so I think it started there, and then I think he had some early training in at the Prague Conservatory. He learned to play the violin. He learned to play the piano. When he was older, he went to Berlin Hochschule, where he was supposed to study law. But to surprise, surprise, his father arrived to discover that he'd actually registered in Schrecker's composition class. And of course, Schrecker was the composition teacher. To get into his class, you had to be pretty good.
I feel like I've heard this. I feel like I've heard this law but study music instead story before.
This is not a new story, and it's funny. It's either it's nice. I want you to be a nice Jewish lawyer or a nice Jewish doctor, but God forbid you should become a nice Jewish composer. So he was immediately cut off. Actually, Julius cut off all his support, and he was left essentially to fend for himself. I think he was very resourceful, and he started meeting very interesting people, celebrities, and he, in fact, somehow ended up accompanying Albert Einstein, who was an amateur fiddle player. I think he met him probably through Einstein's stepdaughter, Margot. And, and from then he went to Prague and met the Kafka circle. Kafka was no longer alive, but Max Brod and Franz Werfel and several others were. And they were all impressed by him, extremely impressed by him. And he started a PhD at the German University in Prague. And then Hitler came along, and he felt that he had to leave. I mean, he saw the writing on the wall, which his father certainly didn't. Julius thought this was just a temporary thing, like so many of that generation, the older Jews thought, well, this is crazy. He's, who could, I mean, it's a sort of familiar pattern that we hear today. I mean, come on, who's going to vote for that guy? Really? He's going to get in again? I mean, no, come on. So this was the same sort of thing, this refusal to think that this was going to carry on and that Hitler was going to gain any ground. Of course, Walter saw, I think he was cosmopolitan enough, and he'd been around to see what was happening. And he'd had a friend who'd been beaten up in Berlin, and the friend of the friend had been killed. And he came from Carlsbad, which was a fairly anti-Semitic town. It was, in the western part of Czechoslovakia and part of the Sudetenland, so very, very strong German influence there. German was his home language. So he decided to leave, and he decided to go to India, to Bombay.
As you mentioned, I mean, he was at odds with his father Julius, not only on the study of music, but on the rise of nationalism in
Yes.
Germany at the time. And wasn't his instructor while working on a PhD, wasn't he a Nazi as well? And then that was really the final straw, right? It was in 1933. He made the move to India.
Yeah, he had a supervisor who was simultaneously supervising a group of Hitler youth in Prague. And as soon as he discovered this, he wrote to the university and said, look, I can't do this PhD being supervised by a Nazi. And so I think that was the cherry on the top.
So why move to India of all places?
Well, that's a very good question. There are probably two answers to that. The first was that it was actually quite easy to get a visa to India at that point. But more important than that, I think, he had developed an interest in music outside the Western tradition when he was living in Berlin. And later on, when he met, I'm forgetting his name now. Anyway, it's in my notes.
Yeah, of course, of course.
he he had developed this real fascination with Indian music. He'd found some recordings of Indian music. This was in the 1920s, and he decided that he wanted to pursue this. So going to India meant that he could study this in situ. And I think he wanted to leave after maybe 3 or 4 years, but by then it was very difficult for him to get out, and he ended up staying there for a dozen years. Bruno Nettel was the chap he studied with in Prague.
Well, as you mentioned, it sounded like he wanted to leave. And again, just reading the liner notes, they are absolutely captivating. They read like a sort of movie script at times in his life. It was there that he really found himself working for the public broadcaster, right? And it was there that he wrote a piece of music that is still being used today, if I understand correctly. That's been heard by hundreds of millions of people as the introduction to the All India broadcast.
Yep, it's the call sign for All India Radio, which of course was set up by the BBC. So just like the BBC has its call sign, All India Radio had its call sign. And he wrote it in around, I think, 1936, and it's been used every day since then. And it's used to this day. It's the same recording. It has this kind of crackly quality to it because it's the original recording.
And he was at the piano in that recording? Is that or believed to be at the piano?
No, it's just a violin and the tampura, which is the drone.
Yeah. And the violin was played by Zubin Mehta's father, something like that.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it really is an incredible story, and the impact that he kind of leaves there. He ended up wanting to leave, as you mentioned, after a few years, hoping to make it to Hollywood, and it was there that he re-enlisted the help of his good friend Albert Einstein, his university pal. It didn't quite work out that way, and that ultimately is how he ended up, by way of returning, or by way of making his way to England, Halifax, and then ultimately Winnipeg. Can you tell us a little bit, rather than talking necessarily about Walter Kaufmann, the music director of the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra, can you tell us a little bit more about his music and the fusion that he created, the sort of hybrid of East meets West? Because this disc really concentrates on the 30s and 40s, the years before he came to Winnipeg.
Yeah, this hybridization, this mix of Western and Western tradition and Indian music is something that informs a lot of his music, or at least the music that I've looked at. There's so much that my opinion might change after another look, but it seems like a lot of his orchestral music, certainly the bulk of his chamber music, most of which he wrote in Bombay, has this melding of the two cultures. And it's that I found initially so enchanting and compelling. It's this ability to join the two together in a way that really makes a musical and artistic sense. Whereas you will often find a composer, say nowadays, who will say, this is an Indian influenced piece, and really all it is a kind of wink in an Indian direction. This is a real um, combination. They both put in the pot and stirred until the end result is it's not two layers. It's a unity, and there are formal elements which are Western, but the actual construction of the melodic material is definitely Indian. Um, but one has to listen to it to really get the proper sense of how successful he was in melding these two cultures.
And listen to it we shall to conclude this interview. Simon, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to connect with us here at Classic 107. We're thrilled to have this disc in our repertoire, for you to discover this repertoire and share it with us with the ARC Ensemble, and especially with the Winnipeg connection. I mean, it just makes it even more special. And as you say, it seems all things seem to emanate from here in the center of the continent.
Yeah, and I just, before I go, there was just one thing I wanted to mention, is that there were so many coincidences attached to Kaufmann and his stay in Winnipeg. It turned out I was speaking to a friend, and I said, I've just found this, this music. It's really quite extraordinary. And I mentioned his name, and he said, well, you should speak to our neighbor. I won't mention her name. She lived, a couple of blocks down. You said, the family were incredibly close to him. In fact, I think, the mother was, romantically involved with him. This was just one of the connections which seemed to, hit the window. It was just quite incredible. And I thought this is some sort of karma. Someone's telling me this is a man that we really should be looking at. All the arrows were pointing in that direction.
Well, thank you again for taking the time today to chat with us here at Classic 107. And here is the ARC Ensemble performing music of Walter Kaufmann.